Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. So we were supposed to cover the 17th century today, but I'm currently reading a book on that. So let's do that next episode once I'm finished reading it. Um, and instead, let's cover the Industrial Revolution. So I am going to explain this in the strangest way possible, where in the philosophy of magic, which is a real thing that stems back to the Middle Ages in the ancient world, it's not Harry Potter. In the legitimate philosophy of magic, there is the magic of kings and the magic of priests. And the magic of priests exists to make you more moral and closer to God, and the magic of kings exists to make you more powerful. And the way I use this frame in history, where the rise of a religion is equivalent to the magic of priests, where you look at Christianity or Islam or Buddhism, they didn't give humanity this quantum leap in actual physical power. They gave it so that humanity could cooperate more easily and had a better value structure and that sort of thing. The Industrial Revolution's not that. The Industrial Revolution is the magic of kings, where humans remained the same crazy monkeys, but you gave these crazy monkeys the power of gods. And the Industrial Revolution, it's possibly the most important event in history. There's like five things that are competing in my mind to be the most important event in history. The Industrial Revolution is competing for the top slot because it completely changed the calculus in a way that's difficult for people to understand, where there's a handful of authors who made what I think were reasonable calculations, like Malthus or Karl Marx or Carlyle. These are all thinkers from the early 19th century who wrote books that made sense. And then the Industrial Revolution just steamrolled them. And that's an interesting way to start because it shows that the Industrial Revolution was such a profound change in the assumptions of life that even the brightest minds from the pre-industrial world could not comprehend what was about to hit them. Where for the pre-industrial world, you lived a life comparable to your great-grandpa. As an example, my last name's Lynch. Lynch is Gaelic for Olanchun, and that's son of a fisherman. And I know my ancestors in Ireland, before they came over to America in the 19th century, they were fishermen. Irish last names are 2,000 years old. What that means is that my family were probably fishermen in possibly the same village for 2,000 years straight. Imagine that. That was normal in the pre-industrial world. And now my family, I live in Texas, but my family's from Pennsylvania in the Northeast. My mom's from Nebraska. Every generation, my family worked a different job. That's post-industrial. This technology we're talking on, no one had Zoom meetings before COVID. And so this speed of change, it's as if the wizards of the West kept on discovering more and more powerful magic every generation, and the world became this game of guessing what new kind of magic people would develop. And now we've just developed powerful genies that can replicate the human mind, and that those genies are AI. And the Industrial Revolution it's fascinating. And if you went back to the time period when it was happening in the mid-19th century, people didn't know what was happening, and they didn't understand the depth of it, where if you talk to philosophers like, as I said before, Malthus or Carlyle or Karl Marx, they passively knew factories are getting bigger, machines are getting more powerful, but they had no comprehension that they were a lifetime away from the atom bomb being invented, and infinite prosperity for everyone. And I'm glad I'm making this video now because our narrative on the Industrial Revolution has changed markedly in just the last 10 years. Because, again, to pull on the philosophy of magic, for every reaction is a counter-reaction. And so when we look at the great advances of the Industrial Revolution, you find that there was this huge increase in prosperity, collapse in diseases, increase in the world's population, positive things. But then we didn't see the negative. And I am going to do something I haven't seen done before in combining both the positives of the Industrial Revolution with the negatives that the Unabomber talks about. Because the Unabomber, I think, actually has a very cogent and intelligent criticism of industrial civilization, something that people at the time viewed the Unabomber as a complete madman. But in just the last 5 years, a lot of the criticisms that we thought were ridiculous have turned out to be true. And I think the time since COVID is a pivotal historic moment because we start seeing the cost that was paid for by the Industrial Revolution in the collapse of our society. And a lot of the wisest critics of the last century, like C.S. Lewis or Amaury de Riancourt or Spengler, they could sense what the issues with the Industrial Revolution were because they saw the world wars and they saw the mass bureaucratization of society. But as I said, I think the most important lesson of the 21st century is that we really need to learn the lessons we didn't learn in the 20th century.
And maybe first we could start by Steelmanning the Unabomber's critiques, or where should we start?
So Steelman says that am I arguing for or against the Unabomber?
For.
Okay, great. You guys should watch my video on said topic. But what the Unabomber said is that industrial civilization promotes over-socialization, which means that the industrial world, one of my favorite history authors, if anyone wants to read a history book as a normal person that explains history the best, it's The Invention of Yesterday by Tamim Ansari. And Tamim Ansari has this interesting metaphor that industrial civilization is this machine, and societies have to develop a negotiation with the machine to get infinite wealth. And industrialization is profoundly cultural, where there are two waves of industrialization. The first wave is British, the second wave is Japanese. In the first wave, your cultural similarity to Britain determined how much you industrialized, and your cultural similarity to Japan in the second wave determined how much you industrialized. So first wave of industrialization, the Americans and the Germans really close to the British, they industrialized really hard. The Spanish and the Russians, less so. The Africans, not at all. In the second wave, the countries close to Japan, like Korea and China, industrialized. Those further away, like Thailand, Indonesia, less so. The reason I bring this up is that industrialization is, at its foremost, a cultural technology, in that certain societies have cultures that allow them to industrialize, because industrialization, it's how well you can work with a systematized system, where the best example of this is the school system. The school system, everyone does the same classes they don't care about. You're forced to wake up early, be sleep deprived, work long hours, sit at your desk. The school system, its purpose is not to teach you stuff, because no one remembers anything they learned in school past age 12. The purpose of the school system is to make sure you're a good wagee, because the factory system, everyone shows up at the same time. You do what your boss tells you to do. You sit at a desk for 9 hours, 10 hours, whatever. This is at odds with most of human nature. For most people in history, they didn't have an employer. They worked for their father, or they had their own private business. In 1920, 90% of Americans worked for themselves or small businesses. In 1990, 90% of Americans were employees. And so what this signifies is that the Industrial Revolution requires a tremendous amount of standardization across people, across broad systems. And an example of this is that pre-World War II, if you read histories of America, America's not treated as a single country. They'll say the Yankees are like this, the Southerners are like this, the Germans are like this. But with the Industrial Revolution, we had to create standardization across America, because all the Walmart employees across the country had to go to the job at the same time and do the same system, because this giant system that is Walmart can only work if everyone cooperates across it uniformly. Walmart and Costco are in strategic levels incredibly impressive businesses. You guys should study the industrial strategy of Walmart and Costco, because they're just this is a pet peeve of mine. These companies are so good at getting people to cooperate and about making things cheap that I find Walmart, Amazon, Costco just insanely impressive. That notwithstanding, said impressiveness is bought at the quality of life for the people involved. And humans are by nature crazy monkeys, and people don't like the standardization. And what the Unabomber said is that this came at the cost of the human soul, where back in pre-industrial society, you wake up, you work with your family, you go to your job when you want, and And then your community and family supplies everything. Your community and family, it's your insurance, it's your military protection, it's your healthcare system, it's your social life. And this is how humans evolved. Humans evolved to have intact communities, families, religion. And these are the things from studies over the last 30 years we've consistently found make people the happiest. And so what industrial civilization does is it turns humans into cogs, and it gives them incredible wealth in exchange for this. But then the term the Unabomber invented is called over-socialization. Over-socialization is the destruction of what makes us human to fit into the machine better. And Tamim Ansari says it's a negotiation between the machine and people. Different societies often don't realize how much they give the machine. And so you look at American culture, our entire society is developed about how to increase industrial productivity. And what the Unabomber said is that leftism is a derivation of resentment against over-socialization, where the left is obsessed with power. And leftist societies only really took over in industrialized societies. Because let's say you're a person, you work at an anonymous job where your boss doesn't care about you. You live in a box. You don't know your neighbors. You don't have anything you really believe in. And you feel completely powerless, where you can't even plant a tree in your house because the HOA doesn't like that. And so it creates this profound resentment. And look at leftism. Leftism is a power fantasy where mankind is a god capable of changing everything. We control reality. And the left always leads to having a dictator with complete power. And the left never changes their strategy because leftists secretly want to be the dictator subconsciously. So they establish a system where a dictatorship has total power, and they don't change it because the purpose is the power fantasy. And you look at the left. The left wants to destroy the family, the religion, community, ethnic ties. They want to destroy the traditional culture, history, identity. The left wants to rip apart every single piece of society. So the only thing that's left is power and the machine. Does that make sense? That's my best summary of what the Unabomber said.
Yes. Now should we critique him?
So the critique of the Unabomber, first of all, he was nuts. He killed a lot of people. That has to be said. A lot of people would forget to say it because it's assumed, but I think it needs to be said. That's the first thing. The second thing is the Unabomber didn't predict the internet, where I think the internet, and this is a Balaji point, I think this is a legitimately brilliant jump Balaji made, that the internet changes the calculation. And one of Balaji's points is the 19th century society was held together by belief in God, the 20th century by the state, the 21st century by the network. And everything the Unabomber says about industrial civilization gets co-opted by the internet, where the whole thing about complex systems and over-socialization and destroying the need to mass coordinate destroying human nature, the internet solves that because the internet allows asynchronous communication very rapidly. So you don't have to show up at your shift at the exact same time as all the other Walmart employees across the country because the internet allows, hey, Donnie, you can start this shift at 9:30. James, you can have this shift at 11:30. So the internet completely changes the calculation of what the Unabomber says. And that's part of the deal with the Industrial Revolution, that the Industrial Revolution, there's a new form of magic every generation that changes the rules. And it's actually pretty fun and terrifying that across the course of our lives, we have no idea what the new technology is going to do. And the Unabomber also, I think he also over-glorified the return to monkey. And I think his return to monkey scenario is completely ridiculous because once you've opened Pandora's box with the Industrial Revolution, you can't go back because the military advantages conveyed by industrialization are so vast. Once Europe industrialized, they were able to conquer the whole continent of Africa, which I think is 4 times Europe's size because they had such a big strategic advantage. And I think the Europeans lost less than 4,000 people in the conquest of all of Africa. And so you can't return to monkey in the same way the Unabomber wants to. For those that don't know, return to monkey means default back onto a pre-industrial society. It's an internet meme. And people who are not in good mental health create mental polarities in their mind, where if you're not in a good headspace, you'll say, this is good, this is bad, and they're opposites. But the reality is the world is often a very muddy and complex place. And when I have to give advice to a friend who's in a hard place, I say, tell me exactly what you want, tell me what you don't want, and then we'll find some middle ground where we can develop something that negates the negative and adds up the positive. So that's my argument against the Unabomber.
Well, that's a good back and forth. Should we get into it?
Yes. So the technology for the Industrial Revolutions existed for thousands of years, where the ancient Greeks had an early version of the computer called the Antikythera. It was a calculating device using mechanics. And the ancient Greeks also had the steam engine. And the Industrial Revolution in our timeline started in 18th century England. And it nearly started in China 1,000 years ago, because in China, in the Sung dynasty, they had these enormous blast furnaces that created an enormous amount of iron on a scale that was not equivalent to anything that existed before in history or would until 19th century Britain. The issue for both the Greeks and the Chinese is that their social structure didn't create incentives for the Industrial Revolution. I say that industrialization is a cultural phenomena for this reason, where in China what happened is that the bureaucracy that ran China created regulations and taxes that were so bad that it created zero incentive to actually build a factory because you wouldn't drive enough benefit. In Greece, slavery was so common that you had no reason to make these advanced machines because a slave could just do the work. And also, applying science to the world was seen as ungentlemanly in ancient Greece. And so, in 18th century Britain, a confluence of variables came together that allowed the Industrial Revolution. And the book Why Nations Fail, this does an amazing job of explaining it. And the thesis of this book is that Britain was one of the first pluralist political systems. Britain was the first truly pluralist political system to develop, in that Britain didn't practice slavery. It had an open labor market. It had a parliamentary democracy that was responsive to the public. There was a patent system, and the merchant classes were in charge. What that means is that Britain was the first society in history, or one of the first, where you had open market, you had political freedom, and you had property rights. What all of that adds up to is that I can make a factory and be completely confident that I will keep the money from the factory. And in most societies in history, if you build the factory, your landlord's going to steal it from you. And what happened is that actually one of the biggest factors here is the invention of the patent system, where the English-speaking countries created a system where if you invented a technology, you would keep the profits from it. That didn't exist beforehand, and it was one of the hugest factors that promulgated the massive technological development, where if you invent something and keep the money, you're going to start inventing a lot of things. Otherwise, there's no incentive to invent things. And this is what the English speakers did really well, that they established incentives for creativity where you would just make stuff and then keep the money. And it created this culture of creativity. And I think an interesting example that presaged the Industrial Revolution was the Agricultural Revolution. And people forget about the Agricultural Revolution, but it's one of the most important events in history, where England and the Netherlands in the early 18th century, they established a system by which people started to use fertilizers scientifically. They started to crossbreed animals to create a larger harvest. And what this did was it doubled the average quality of life in England or the Netherlands, because they made the price of food so much vastly cheaper that people's lives became significantly better. And it opened up all this extra spending money that made the English and the Dutch and their diasporas the wealthiest place in the world. And it's interesting that France never went through the agricultural revolution in the early 18th century. And that's possibly the biggest reason why France had a revolution and the English speakers didn't. Because the English speakers, quality of life massively increased. And in France, it kept going down because it never had said agricultural revolution. And the reason France didn't was it was an oligarchic absolute monarchy. And instead, oligarchic absolutist monarchy, the government ran everything. So there was little incentive for these wealthy people to invest in their own farms. And everyone was in the capital, Paris, partying to please the king. And also, France didn't have a free market. It didn't have private enterprise. Its property rights weren't as good. And so I like to emphasize that property rights and rule of law are probably the most important things that a society can have. And if you have property rights and rule of law, your society will be wealthy. Every society with both those things will be wealthy. And the Industrial Revolution started in the northwest of England in the mid-18th century. And the interesting thing is that the same diaspora community created both the Industrial Revolution in America and in Britain, where my ancestors, my mom's side of the family is English. I did a 23andMe, and my family's from the part of England that did the Industrial Revolution, the area around Liverpool and Manchester and Birmingham, that area, the Midlands. And that area's diaspora in America started the American Industrial Revolution, where Pennsylvania and the Delaware Valley, that was where the Industrial Revolution, that in Massachusetts is where it first happened in America. And in Britain, it was people from the northwest of England. And an interesting factoid here is that the Quakers were instrumental in the creation of the Industrial Revolution. And the Quakers are a pacifist, mystic sect of Protestantism. And I was raised a Quaker. And they sit in a room and meditate for an hour. And when you meditate, you feel the will of God move through you. The Quakers had very high social trust, where everyone trusts each other inside their communities. So the Bank of England and the Bank of America were both established by Quakers because they could accumulate capital in a high trust environment. This high trust also established that the Quakers were the ones who built the Quaker cultural areas were the areas that made the first factories. And there's an interesting book I read called North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, and it was written around the time of the American Civil War. And the people from the north of England populated the north of America. People from the south of England populated the south of America. And so North and South was how the rural south of England, it's this rom-com about a girl from the rural south of England who goes to the industrialized north. And it's funny, you could have written the same story in America at the same time. The south of America was rural and agrarian and farming and aristocratic. And the north of America was merchant class, more rowdy, more technologically advanced. And the thesis of the book speaks to the Industrial Revolution a lot, where the book shows how the north of England, which was industrialized, it was a society that removed the rural concepts of social duty, where a landlord had duties to his peasants, and there was these strong social, tight-knit communities. But the author ultimately says the North English system is better because it's more dynamic, it's more creative, the peasants are the poor people are wealthier. And the first generation of the Industrial Revolution was absolutely brutal. And you look at Karl Marx, who writes a lot about this, where Karl Marx was reacting to the horrifying conditions of the first generation of industrialization, where part of the reason the Industrial Revolution happened was that Europe was experiencing acute overpopulation, which meant that people were incredibly poor. And Marx blamed this on capitalism, but it was really a global trend that was occurring in India and China and Brazil due to overpopulation. The thing, though, is that Europe broke out of it through the Industrial Revolution, where the Industrial Revolution made people so much vastly wealthier that in the 1840s, the average European was horrifyingly poor. Les Miserables talks about this as well, where people would work 14, 16-hour days. They would crowd into the same room with 20 people in one room. There was typhoid and cholera. It was completely unbearable. And this was a time period when Europe was on the verge of revolution, and that's the sentiment Karl Marx was speaking to, of the workers need to rebel against the capitalists. But in North and South, which was set around the time of the U.S. Civil War, 1860, what they say is that the Industrial Revolution had already increased the quality of life, where real poverty had declined massively. And so over the course of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, quality of life in Western Europe went up incredibly quickly, which is why by the time you get to World War I in the early 20th century, why Western Europe was so patriotic and people were happy to die for their countries. And in Eastern Europe, the Industrial Revolution happened much more slowly and smaller, which is why the world wars in Eastern Europe were so much more brutal, because the quality of life had gotten worse, which had made people less sympathetic and more genocidal. If you see a society that commits genocide, assume it's overpopulated. Genocide is a human biological switch that comes from resource scarcity. Of course, I don't condone genocide. I'm merely explaining the biological reasons it happens. And so Industrial Revolution started in Britain, and Britain saw this turn with the Corn Laws, where the Corn Laws, Britain switched from, this is 1831, I think, from a tariff system that prioritized the agricultural nobility to lowering the cost, basically importing food, weakening the old agricultural nobility in exchange for tariffs for industrial goods. And the same thing happened in America at the same time. And America is one of the most strange structured industrializations, where America has taken something like 200 years to industrialize, where at the time of the American Revolution, there were some factories in America, in Philadelphia, where Valley Forge was this giant, Valley Forge in the American Revolution video, it was this giant industrial scale ironwork outside Philadelphia. And so America took from the 18th century until the late 20th century to industrialize. There are certain areas of the American South, like Mississippi or South Carolina, that only industrialized in the 1970s. And Peter Zeihan writes about the influence on American society due to having such a slow and gradual industrial revolution. And parts of America industrialized very early due to the cultural proximity with Britain. And you can see it in America's regional cultures, where the northern United States, the Rust Belt, that region used to be the wealthiest place in the world, and the Rust Belt was able to use its industrial edge to effectively colonize the rest of the continent, where there was this period of American history when Chicago, New York, Philadelphia treated the rest of the North American continent as colonies, where they'd have railroads or banks or firms that would get resources in South Carolina or California, then ship it to the Rust Belt. And Peter Zeihan makes the argument that this gradualistic industrialization creates interesting parts of American culture where big regional differences. America is a more religious, more suburban society due to the gradual industrialization, etc. And back in Europe, after England and Scotland industrialized super early, Ireland didn't really industrialize till the second half of the 20th century. And on the European continent, as I said, the places culturally closest to Britain, like the Netherlands and the Dutch, industrialized. And you have two interesting models of industrialization. You have the Anglo-Saxon model and the German model. The Anglo-Saxon English speakers, that's private enterprise industrializes the society. So it's factory owners building their own factories with their own money. And the German model is that when Germany unified in the 1870s, Germany realized that they needed to industrialize very quickly. And so the state industrialized through paying weapons firms to build these giant armaments factories. And Germany had an incredibly rapid industrialization due to Germany unifying into a single country through a series of wars. So all these regional markets became this trans-German market. And you can see the German-style industrialization pushed by the state in a couple things. Germany was very aggressive in the early 20th century with the world wars because Germany's industrialization was so rapid that you had this giant rural population that was shoved into the cities, got wealth very quickly. So they were pushing these conservative rural values onto the rest of Germany industrialized so quickly through the military that it created this very aggressive society. And the Russians, the Japanese, the Koreans, and partly the Italians all had this German industrial system pushed by the state. And this created very aggressive militaristic societies, because the industrialization in said societies created this bureaucratic imperialist ruling class. In Russia, where they industrialized through states like the military, the Soviets wanted to conquer everything around them. And Britain and France and the English-speaking countries industrialized through private initiative. And so, interestingly, that created a ruling class where they prioritize psychological manipulation. Because if your ruling class is corporate, the corporations need to learn how to manipulate the population to buy their product. And so what happened was the creation of these feminine, psychological, manipulative elites in France and English-speaking countries versus the aggressive, militaristic, top-down authorities in Russia, Germany, Japan, whatever. And the Germanic countries, culturally closer to Britain, they industrialized really strongly, where Germany became the industrial powerhouse of Europe. And that was the biggest driver for World War I, this staggered industrialization across Europe, because you can actually correlate the Industrial Revolution with population growth. Because what happens is that once a society industrializes, it goes through a very rapid population growth. And then once the people are in cities and cities can't replicate, the population crashes. So Britain and France went through their industrial period of growth in the mid to early 19th centuries. And so that's what caused the English speakers to populate Canada and America and Australia and South Africa. And it's also why the Europeans took over Africa. People ask me, Rudyard, why did Europe colonize Africa? And the short answer is the Europeans, industrializing is the equivalent of shoving a massive amount of testosterone supplements to a population. Because you have all these aggressive young men, and the Europeans thought, we could conquer Africa, let's conquer Africa. And the Europeans lost almost no men colonizing Africa, and the Industrial Revolution, it created medicine against malaria, and it created medicine against the diseases that made Africa inhospitable for white people. And it also established the technology like railroads and steam engines, which allowed the Europeans to take over Africa. In the American West, you couldn't farm areas like Nebraska or Texas until you had industrial-grade plows and barbed wire. Or the American South, like Florida or South Carolina, was uninhabitable until you had malaria medicine. So the Industrial Revolution legitimately changed the geography of the world. West Europe's wave of industrialization resulted in the colonization of a lot of the Third World. And once Western Europe lost its young men, a lot of them died in the world wars, West Europe just gave up its colonies. So that's a demographic trend playing out in real time. Central and Eastern Europe had their demographic wave associated with the Industrial Revolution in the early to mid 20th centuries. And as I was alluding to before I went on this tangent, World War I was the British and the French knew the Germans were getting an industrial advantage over them, so they wanted a war with Germany before Germany could get too powerful. Then the Germans knew the Russians were industrializing, so the Germans wanted a war with the Russians before the Russians would get too powerful. And so you can see the politics of industrialization creating this huge continent of really aggro-European young men, and then it was dispelled in the world wars. And Samo has made an interesting comment that I think people should look into more, that we need to develop a classification of territories called post-industrial, because a lot of Europe is entering the post-industrial stage, and my home state of Pennsylvania is also post-industrial, where there were these societies that used to be industrial powerhouses, and then the Industrial Revolution burnt their social institutions because humans did not evolve to live in cities. And so because the Industrial Revolution creates these unnatural conditions, the societies that have been industrialized for the longest, like the northeastern US or the northwest of Europe, are now pushing civilizational suicide through wokeness. And I don't think that's a coincidence, where these societies are pushing for mass immigration, deindustrialization, climate initiatives to get rid of a modern economy, because humans didn't evolve for the Industrial Revolution. And it's very comparable to in agricultural societies. We know from archaeology that the agricultural innovation, which is the invention of agriculture, is a breakthrough in similar scale to the Industrial Revolution and just changing the quantum size of the human community. And what we found with the invention of agriculture is that population skyrockets, crashes, skyrockets again, crashes again. And we don't know exactly why that happened. It's probably a combination of wars and disease and famine, the things that normally kill humans. But the Industrial Revolution is less than 200 years old already. And so I think we will experience catastrophes like that as it takes us thousands of years to fully acclimate to what an industrialized society really means. And I think I would tell people to grapple with that more, but I don't think they have the mental capability to do so. I think it would just give them panic attacks. And climate change is a great example. And I don't know whether I believe in climate change. It could happen, it could not happen. But climate change is an example of the quandaries of an industrialized civilization. We started pumping out all of this carbon emissions, and that wasn't an issue 300 years ago. And I am going to look at South Europe as an interesting example, because the south of Italy, the north of Italy industrialized, but the south of Italy, the south of Spain, these are societies that Francis Fukuyama calls modern but not industrial. And what that means is, let's look at Greece as an example. Greece is a society with sewers, with some air conditioning, with modern medicine. But Greece never had the factories. It never had the modern jobs. And this is an interesting tier of modern society that no one's really studied, but I think is important, because I think about over a quarter of the world's population fits into this, where it's a society that had all the health advances and the electricity, but they never had the industry. And so what happens to these societies is they're stuck in this weird sort of dependency off wealthier societies. This is what happened to Latin America. It's what happened to South Europe. It's what happens in the Middle East, where if you look at the Middle East, places like Iraq, they have the food, the health, the electricity, but Iraq doesn't have any jobs. And so what happens is that these societies end up becoming places of political turmoil and of dissatisfaction, where South Italy and South Spain produced these communist movements over the 20th century because the young guys had nothing to do. The Middle East produces radical Islam. And so societies have these population boosts due to industrialization, but the societies that don't get jobs due to the factories are stuck in these weird places that aren't particularly healthy. And that's a side story of the Industrial Revolution I wish people talked about, but didn't, where the Industrial Revolution, it pushes both freedom and servitude, where the Industrial Revolution, it ended slavery in America, it ended serfdom. And part of the reason that's humanitarian, but the other reason is that the incentive for an industrialized society is to standardize labor, because the standardization of labor allows the easier coordination across regions. Globalization is a side effect of industrialization, because people are globalists because this t-shirt is designed in California, it's made in Cambodia, the cotton was picked in America or India. So when a t-shirt's made in 5 countries, you can see why the elite likes globalization. And I think globalization is part of this interesting push of standardization. And so the philosophic endpoint of industrialization that's bad is viewing mankind as a god who needs to standardize and break the world apart to be like us. And industrialization leads to power fantasies. And that's the biggest philosophic issue I think we need to get through with industrialization, because the benefits of industrialization are completely obvious. And that's something I think goes understated because people today aren't happy about industrialization. But we have all of the air conditioning and the health, and the world's population now is 8 times what it, over the course of the Industrial Revolution, the world's population's gone over 8 times over. And those people are better fed, they're healthier than their ancestors were beforehand. And the Industrial Revolution has so many benefits that frequently bringing them up. If the Industrial Revolution has so many benefits that talking about the negatives often appears insane, but there are negatives. I know you have to get going in 5 minutes, but the thing with the Industrial Revolution is that it was gradually staggered over the whole world, where it started out in Britain, the northwest of Europe, and then the second wave of industrialization was in Japan. And Japan's a real wild card where to predict Japan industrialized is just, you would need to be an absolute genius and an original thinker to guess beforehand. But Japan industrialized in the late 19th century, and ironically, Japan faced the negatives of industrialization before any other society. And so a lot of my favorite authors who were writing in the World War II era, they could predict the endpoint of industrialization was collapsing birth rate, aging population, social isolation, meaninglessness, nihilism, because they were already looking at Japan, which had some of those traits in the 1950s, which is, they were very intelligent. And then the industrial revolution moved to China and Korea and Taiwan in the late 20th century. And Korea, I think, is the society where the negatives of the Industrial Revolution are most pronounced, where Koreans sleep the least of any industrialized population. They have the worst mental health. They have highest rates of suicide. And I think these sorts of traits, because the East Asian countries are the places where that's worse, as well as Korea has the least kids of any country, because they're such collectivist societies that when you add on top industrialization to collectivism, you end up with something that's profoundly anti-human. And it's why a lot of East Asia comes across as very cyberpunk dystopia. And now we're seeing a new wave of industrialization across the third world, where Southeast Asia is industrializing. And I find that very interesting. And you see all the same trends in Southeast Asia as what you saw in Europe 200 years ago, where Europe had the amount of ghost sightings skyrocketed during the Industrial Revolution, because ghost sightings are a proxy for mental health issues. And so that's what you saw. That they're seeing in Southeast Asia, you have a huge mental health crisis that no one talks about because mental health is taboo in Southeast Asia. India's Industrial Revolution is through the service economy, not actual factories. So India's kind of fitting the South European parallels, not the South European parallels of modernization without industrialization. And when you look at the third world or you look at East Asia, you're looking at societies that are fitting a lot of the European parallels, and you wonder, will Asia have its own version of World War I, where these industrialized populations just release their excess testosterone demographic energy? And a large part of the world isn't industrialized, but they're experiencing a lot of the failings of modernization without industrialization. So the Middle East, faith in Islam has crashed in the Middle East over the last 10 years. Birth rates have crashed in the Middle East. Iran has a lower birth rate than America now. And we are entering a brave new world with the Industrial Revolution, where I hope we don't end up with 1984, because we have this godlike technology that we don't know what to do with. And part of me wonders if the demographic collapses are some kind of natural evolutionary process to take humanity down a peg so we have more time to think through the ramifications of the godlike technology that we have now. And the Industrial Revolution gives us this great power that makes you ask the question, what do a bunch of silly monkeys do with the power of gods? Because they could either bring heaven on earth, as the late 20th, the West since World War II is as close to heaven on earth as humans have made. It was no diseases, infinite wealth, infinite prosperity, etc. No real poverty, no major wars. Mankind created heaven on earth while also establishing the totalitarianism of the 20th century. And that is the great paradox of the Industrial Revolution. Do you have any questions?
I mean, that was a great overview. I mean, part of it, I was asked, like, where do you think the traditional narrative of the Industrial Revolution sort of differs from your perception of it,
So
separate from what you've said already?
the traditional narrative is, woohoo, this is heaven on earth. We're so much better than our ancestors. And I like to say any given traditional narrative on any topic is half true and it misses the other half. And so it is true that the Industrial Revolution created this quantum breakthrough in human development. But we're completely ignoring the negatives, and also we're completely discounting the same person who lives through this. We are fundamentally identical to what our ancestors were. I am genetically identical to my ancestors who were fishermen for 2,000 years. And I think that's the most important fact we have to keep in mind, because we like to imagine that because we have the power of gods, we've taken on the moral character of gods.
That's a good quote. That makes sense.
So, best books in this topic: Why Nations Fail. This is a really good book on the political ramifications of on how the politics created the Industrial Revolution. Tragedy and Hope. This is just holistically one of the best books ever. Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quickly. I assume none of you will read this, but I will shame you until some of you at least try. It's such a long book. I really haven't gotten into the totalitarianism that came out of the Industrial Revolution, but that's we've covered that in other videos, where the Industrial Revolution let the state have incredible power, which led to Hitler and Stalin and people just massively abusing the power. I quoted the Unabomber's manifesto a lot. That's like 30 pages. So the positives is really, so if you want to see the best and the worst is, the worst side of it is Bloodland by Timothy Snyder. That goes through the logic for, it was industrialized genocide, where the Nazis and the Soviets both thought if they just killed a tremendous amount of people, we would reach a utopia. So the worst side of this is Bloodland by Timothy Snyder. The best side of this is Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, where Steven Pinker just goes through all of the stats of, we've saved 800 million lives with malaria. We've clean water saved 2 billion lives. And both of these are true at the same time.
Yeah, worth keeping in those two tensions at the same time. So yeah, I think we did a great job paying tribute to the Unabomber.
Exactly.
and his argument, as well
Sounds
as giving a wide overview of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Roger, this was great.
Of course. Catch you next time for 17th century Europe.